Good morning, afternoon, evening. Good to see y'all. Hi there. I wanted to pop on today and talk a little bit about how to cope when your boundaries hurt people. I think it's one of the biggest things that we're afraid of when we start talking about setting boundaries. And I kind of wanted to start by sharing one of my favorite quotes on this subject by Brene Brown, the queen. It's the best. She says, "Daring to set boundaries is about having the courage to love ourselves, even when we risk disappointing others." I hear that and I'm just like, thank you, right? Because that is such a wonderful reminder that boundaries really at their core are often an act of self-love. You know, they're not against other people. Rarely are they malicious or intended to harm. They're about protecting ourselves. I like to think of them as verbal self-defense, right? So, on that subject, I think it's important for us to discuss. Yeah, Brene, I know, right? She's the best. But I do think it's important for us to discuss the very real thing that sometimes happens when we set boundaries, which is sometimes our boundaries hurt people. Sometimes our totally righteous, totally necessary, totally self-love informed boundaries leave other people feeling sad or disappointed or hurt or angry or betrayed, right? I'm sure you've been there. I know I have been. And that's really tricky because it's a lot to cope with, especially if you're a recovering people pleaser who has built an identity around making other people happy, right? It's kind of a total identity crisis in a way, because we know we're entitled to this boundary because we talk about this all the time, but at the same time, someone's hurt. And that's really hard to cope with. And so during today's live, I kind of wanted to leave you with 4 of my favorite strategies for how to cope and how to find self-forgiveness when your righteous boundaries or boundaries that you really need hurt people. And if you're sitting here watching thinking can you give me an example? What I see some comments what's an example of a boundary that might hurt somebody? There are lots. For example, I'm sure some of you have been there where you've decided to end a romantic relationship with somebody who was still in love with you, right? That's a boundary, a breakup. And you probably didn't even want to hurt the person you were breaking up with, but they still felt hurt and betrayed. It can be the same thing when you ask a friend, a family member, a colleague for distance or space. That's a righteous boundary, but it might leave someone feeling hurt. Or even with your family of origin, if you're becoming an adult and you realize it's time for me to move away, it's time for me to start an independent life of my own and really branch out, inadvertently, that can leave your family feeling hurt or betrayed. And these are all examples of totally righteous, totally fair boundaries that we can set to protect our well-being and emotional and mental health that sometimes have negative consequences for other people. And so what do? Right? Because if you're anything like me, if I set a boundary with someone I don't wish to harm, like a friend or a family member, and they feel really betrayed or hurt or angry with me, gotta be honest, it's one of the worst feelings in the world, right? One of my favorite folks, Holly Whitaker, who is a person in the sober community, says sometimes when we start setting boundaries, it can feel like a death. And it is a death. Because it's the death of the part of ourselves that believes we have to sacrifice ourselves in order to be valued by others. And it is scary sometimes. And so here are some of the 4 ways. I'm going to put my coffee down so I can use both my hands. Some of the ways that I really like to cope with this. So the first thing I want to talk about is the difference between the boundary how and the boundary why. So when we're setting a boundary, there are 2 things, right? There's the reason we're setting the boundary, which is kind of the need behind it, the need for space, the need for distance, the need for time. And there's also the how of the boundary. So what words you use, what tone of voice you use, literally how you set the boundary. And sometimes we set a totally valid and righteous boundary, but the how gets a little bit wonky. So maybe we use a tone of voice that we're not proud of, or maybe we have the conversation in a way that, looking back, doesn't align with our integrity. It's possible in this case that the person is hurt, not because of the boundary itself, but because of how we set it. Not all the time, but sometimes. I've found it's really helpful to take responsibility for the boundary how, while also like knowing that the boundary why, the need that we were standing up for with that boundary is totally valid, right? So you can have a follow-up conversation with the person who's feeling hurt and say something like, you know what, when we had that conversation, I was feeling really reactive and I set that boundary in a way I'm not proud of. You know, I used certain language I didn't need, or I totally blew up, and for that, I'm really sorry. I still need the space and time that I told you about, but in terms of the how it happened, I'm sorry about that, right? So all of a sudden, it's like taking responsibility for the how and just letting the why exist. Now, this second one is actually my all-time favorite method for how to kind of self-soothe and find self-forgiveness. Imagine what would have happened if you had not set the boundary that you needed, and then project into the future. Imagine it's 6 months from now, and you never set the boundary. Imagine and really envision 1 year from now, what things would be like if you didn't set the boundary. And then even think out 5 years. Now, the reason I like this exercise so much is because it really puts things in perspective, right? I see in the comments a lot of people, if we imagine not setting the boundary and not taking the distance or the time or the space that we need, a lot of us can imagine a whole boatload of uncomfortable resentment. We can imagine spending 6 months or a year constantly betraying ourselves and even acting inauthentically in that person's presence because you're feeling a feeling that you're not expressing, right? And many of us have spent our lives acting that way as people pleasers, and we want to let that crap go, right? You can also imagine how not setting a boundary would lead to you feeling really restricted and unable to engage in the things that matter most to you, whether it's new friends, different pursuits, a new workplace, living your most embodied life. Like, all of this stuff is really juicy, and these are all things that we tend to neglect if we decide not to set a boundary. So next time, you're feeling a little bit unhappy or you're afraid you've hurt someone with a boundary, pause and ask yourself, I know this is hard right now, but think ahead. What would have happened if I hadn't said it? It's almost like taking a long view and recognizing, yes, it sucks in the moment. It's like ripping a Band-Aid off, right? But when you think to the future, sometimes the clear, simple boundary is the kindest choice. And I'm sure some of us have been there with that. I did want to say, we talk all about this at my upcoming Boundaries workshop happening on the 23rd, Empowered Boundaries for the Recovering People Pleaser. So I'm just popping the link to that in the comments, so y'all can check that out if you want to join. It's going to be a blast. And if you can't make it live, you can check out the on-demand recording. So I think there are 2 more tips I want to give you for, how to cope if your boundaries are hurting people. The third one is recognizing that there's a difference between the intention of your boundary and the impact of your boundary. Here's what I mean when I say that. If you need to ask someone you care about or someone you respect for space or time or distance, that's a valid intention, right? Your intention is to protect yourself. Your intention is to prioritize your mental health. Your intention is to be okay. Now, sometimes that can have a hard impact, meaning that the person on the receiving end feels betrayed, hurt, sad, flabbergasted, and uncertain. But I think it's really important to remember when you're feeling kind of crappy because your boundary hurt someone, what was your intention for this? Odds are it wasn't to be malicious. It wasn't to harm them. If anything, you probably would have given a lot to ensure that this person didn't feel any negative repercussion for your boundary, right? So remembering that the intention of the boundary was not to harm, but rather just to live in alignment with your integrity and be honest and transparent and clear, helps us remember that the intention is what's really in our control. And that's tough. It can be hard to release that. And I think that the last thing I want to leave you with, kind of like tip number 4 for how to cope if your boundaries hurt someone, is remember that we are blossoming boundary setters, right? Like if you're here watching this live, or if you follow my account, you'll know that I speak to recovering people pleasers. That's kind of like the folks I wish to speak with. That's us. And boundary setting is new, right? It's like really freaking scary. It's unfamiliar. And after years or decades or even generations of subjugating our needs and making other people comfortable, we are finally, fiercely stepping out and saying, actually, my needs and my comfort matters too. So I'm going to take some steps to protect that. And hell yes, like that is good, important work. But the reason I say all of this is because we're not going to get it perfect right away. Like, where is this like expectation of perfection coming from, that we're going to set the perfect boundary and use all the right words and no one's going to feel anything negative ever again and it's all going to be easy peasy, right? That's absurd. I know if you're here, you're like, yeah, ideally, wouldn't that be great? But that's not reality. And check in with yourself. Like when you're setting this boundary and doing that really hard, courageous, brave thing, are you holding yourself to a standard of perfection of stating it and perfection of outcome that literally doesn't exist? I say this because I know I do that sometimes. And we can feel like we've failed or feel like we're a horrible person, when in reality, we've just done a really freaking courageous and brave thing, prioritized our needs when it was unfamiliar, and worked through that on the other side, right? And really what's interesting about this work is that we can learn from it. You know, maybe you didn't set the boundary using all the right words, whatever that means. Maybe you waited until a resentment got so strong and then you just popped and you hate that happened. Maybe you realized that you became close with somebody that wasn't actually a good fit, but perhaps you waited too long to end the relationship or step back and you feel some guilt about that. All of these are examples of ways we don't do it perfectly. Again, whatever that means. But all of this stuff serves as excellent education and lessons for the future. So every time we make a mistake or we fail, we can say, all right, what did I do this time that I didn't love? And how can I bring that knowledge and new wisdom into my future relationships with family, friends, lovers, colleagues, and community members? So maybe the lesson that you're taking away from this is, in the future, I'm going to be a little bit more discerning and slower about who I let into my inner circle and my heart. Maybe the lesson you take away is, I'm going to really pace out relationships instead of diving in 100% in the first week without really getting a sense of how aligned this person and I are. All of these are examples of ways that we learn, and all of our future relationships, promise, all of them will benefit from this learning you're doing now when you're sitting in this uncomfortable feeling of a boundary not going quite right. Right now it sucks. I will totally give that to you. And there's some real self-soothing required to kind of move through this difficulty. I'm not going to gloss it over with a pretty picture, because it's not. It's hard. It's hard, right? But if we can move through this difficulty and come out the other side, we'll have learned a hell of a lot. And our future relationships that we're working on building will benefit from the clarity and the discernment and the transparency we've gained through this. And once again, I just want to share with y'all, we talk all about this type of thing at my upcoming workshop, Empowered Boundaries for the Recovering People Pleaser. It's happening next week. It's always a blast. I just dropped the link in the comments so you can check it out. You can buy a ticket to the live or watch the recording on demand whenever you want, as soon as today. So those are my favorite 4 ways to cope when my righteous boundaries have hurt other people. And I kind of actually just wanted to open up the floor now to see if anyone had any questions. You can send a question through the app, which I am learning. I'm in the early days of Instagram Live, but it's pretty fun, gotta tell you. Or feel free to just drop them in the comments and I'll give them a shout, and do the best I can to answer them. I also have a blog about this topic on my website if you want to check that out as well. I see a question, is it okay to be in a rebellious stage towards my parents because I'm resentful of the boundaries I let go? Yeah, totally. So this is really common. I'm going to grab my coffee for this one. This is really common. So a lot of us as recovering people pleasers have a history of, whether it's like with family, friends, lovers, of like letting people kind of take too much from us, right? Or we act like people pleasers. We bend over, we give too much, right? Bend over backwards. And I think the thing is, once we start breaking the people pleasing pattern, we begin to recognize all of the ways and the times that we've sacrificed our own needs to make ourselves comfortable. And with that can come a hell of a lot of anger, resentment, rebelliousness, and wanting to just leave that good person or good girl or good whatever identity behind. It's like, screw this, man. I'm done with this. I deserve to be embodied and free. And so if you feel like you're going through a rebellious phase, like the question asker said, or if you feel like you're starting to experience really uncomfortable feelings of anger, it's normal, because the part of you that has been neglected for so long is coming back online. Your true self is coming back online, and they're saying, hey, this doesn't work for me anymore. And they're a little angry about it, and you can let that part of you come out and breathe. It's normal. To the person who asked. I'm looking at the questions. I'm so glad y'all are here. This is really fun. I feel manipulated when I'm told I'm cruel or insensitive for reclaiming boundaries. How can I de-escalate that while staying firm in the moment? This is super common as well, right? We start breaking patterns by setting boundaries, and people in our life don't like it because they've become accustomed to a version of us who is the chill one, the laid back one, the easygoing one. If y'all have ever heard of Harriet Lerner, she has a great book called The Dance of Intimacy. And in it, she talks about how when we start setting boundaries or breaking old patterns in our relationships, it's really common for people to have what's called counter moves, meaning people want us to change back to the old, comfortable, familiar version of who we were. And so they'll push us, or they'll judge us, or they'll say, you're just not as fun as you used to be, or whatever the case is. Or they'll say, you know, you're cruel and insensitive, like the person who posted in the comments. And I think the biggest thing we can do for ourselves here, and it's easier said than done, is sticking to our own reality in those moments. What I mean by this is that, especially for the recovering people pleaser, it's really easy to take on others' judgments and impressions of us as our own, because we're so used to prioritizing other people's realities and feelings before our own, right? So when someone tells us we're cruel or insensitive, it's so easy to be like, oh my God, I'm cruel and insensitive. And that sucks. In that moment, what I encourage you to do is redirect your mental energy back to your own version of reality. Remind yourself, why did I set this boundary? What need of mine was I righteously protecting? And did I set it in a way that honors my integrity? Was it clear? Was it honest? Was it said in a somewhat compassionate way? Right? Redirect it all back in. Use your own values as the compass by which you judge your own actions. And this takes a hell of a lot of time and practice. You know, I still go through this. Like when I set a boundary with someone and there's a lot of difficult pushback or anger or whatever, I really have to look within and say, was this in my integrity? Was I honest? Was I real? And if the answer is yes, then I need to self-soothe through the difficulty of someone being unhappy with me and do my best to let that go, because that's their reality. And I need to kind of let them have their reality while I allow myself to have my own. I hope that's helpful. That's a really good question. I missed a couple here. Let's see, I see some questions. I set up a boundary and now I regret it. Is it normal to feel regret, or am I just holding on to my old people-pleasing pattern? What a good question. Holy cow. Does that ever happen? Yes. It's really common, or I won't say really common, but it's definitely common for us to set a boundary and then regret it. Because again, I said this earlier, if you weren't here for the video, like, we are learning to set boundaries, and like any new skill, it requires practice. We're not going to start setting boundaries and all of a sudden be like, woohoo, I am the best boundary setter in all the land. I did it infallibly. Like, no, right? We're going to practice. We're going to screw up. We're learning. Sometimes in the beginning, it's common. We start with no boundaries. Then we set so many fierce, hard boundaries. And we're like, oh God, what have I done? The pendulum just swung in the totally opposite direction. And this is all normal. So if you identify as a recovering people pleaser and you set a boundary and you're like, I regret the boundary, that's okay. Also, it's worth noting that our boundaries are fluid and dynamic because so are we. If our boundaries are simply statements and reflections of us and our needs at any given moment, we're always changing. Our needs are always changing. And as a result, our boundaries are always changing too. So maybe you set a boundary and then maybe you're like, oh God, okay, I don't really feel this way anymore. Or maybe you're ready to loosen it. Maybe you're ready to let someone back into your life who you had originally said couldn't fit. Or maybe you're over the distance and time you needed and it's time to be connected again. You can always, and I want to leave you with this too, you can always reopen a boundary setting conversation. You can always revisit boundaries. You can always go back. Does that mean, now, caveat, does that mean the other person is going to be okay with having that conversation again? No. Maybe it's done for them, but for you, give yourself permission to revisit boundary conversations when you realize your boundary is shifted. We grow and change, so will our boundaries. And I'm sharing in the chat one more time, we are having a boundary setting workshop next week. It's called Empowered Boundaries for the Recovering People Pleaser. It is always a blast. And in fact, the on-demand recording is available at my website right now if you want to get ahead and kind of just watch the recording on your own. So I'm posting that comment in the chat so you can find it. It is always so much fun. And I'm checking now. I know there are some more questions here. Let's see. Ooh, beautifully gifted. I love this question. You said setting clear boundaries stems from a clarity of our needs. How can we get more in tune with our true needs? So that's absolutely true, right? When we set boundaries, boundaries are a self-protective mechanism, and basically we set them in order to prioritize our own needs, right? So maybe you need everything from more affection, more respect. Maybe you need time, distance. Maybe you need independence. But the question is, what are your needs? Because you can't set a boundary to protect your needs unless you know what your needs are. And for the recovering people pleaser, I'm talking to everyone here who identifies that way, including myself, it can be really hard to access what our needs are when we have spent a lifetime being hyper-vigilant and attuned to other people's feelings and needs, right? Like if someone asks you, where do you want to go for dinner tonight? You might be like, wherever you want, I don't know. And in your core, you might feel like you really do not know. And that's a little bit disorienting, but there are tangible steps we can take to get back in touch with who we are and our needs. I'll share some of them just off the cuff real quick. First one is that the body never lies, right? So the body is an incredible place to begin when you're trying to learn what your needs are. What I mean by that is listen to what your body is telling you when someone asks you to do something or when someone offers you something. Notice the sensations. Really breathe. Notice, is there tightness in your chest? Is there an icky, grumbling tightness in your tummy? Does your head feel heavy? Does your body literally feel heavy and weighted down? All of that can be a sign that this request or this thing doesn't feel good for you. And that's okay. That can be a good time to set a boundary. Also, start even simpler than that. Notice when you're hungry. Notice when you're tired. Notice when you have to pee, right? Leave the work meeting, run to the bathroom. A lot of us as recovering people pleasers, I know it sounds a little bit silly, but we have a history of neglecting even our most benign needs, our most trivial needs, so to speak. And so we start slow. If you struggle to access your needs, start with the bare minimum. What, am I hungry right now? Where do I want to go to dinner tonight? Do I need a nap? How long should I sleep? And what's really interesting about this too, and this is going beyond the scope of the question, but I'm on a roll and I want to talk about it. In order to set effective boundaries with other people, it's often important to begin by setting effective boundaries with ourselves, right? So what do I mean by that? Basically, a boundary with ourselves is a promise we make to ourselves about what type of behavior we'll accept from ourselves and others. So for example, let me think of a good way of putting this into practice here. Let's say that I have weak boundaries with myself. So I don't have a clear standard around how I wish to be treated or what I want from other people. And then let's imagine someone in my life speaks to me in a cruel way or is rude to me. If I haven't made a promise to myself, I will not allow myself to be treated cruelly by other people, when someone else is cruel to me, I will struggle to set a boundary with them. Because how can I set a boundary externally with another person? if I haven't committed to myself that my needs and my comfort are worthy of protection? Right? A lot of us would benefit, if you're new to the boundary setting game and you're not sure where to begin, I'd encourage you to look inward and ask yourself, are you setting boundaries with yourself around what you will and will not accept from yourself and from other people? If you are constantly neglecting your own needs for food, for sleep, for rest, for socialization, and for whatever, how are you going to set clear and effective boundaries with other people around getting those needs met? It's hard. A lot of times this work starts in the home front. It starts inside. And so that's a really great way to start as well. Also, I know I've said this a couple times, but I know we've got a lot of fun people here. We are having a boundary setting workshop next week. It's called Empowered Boundaries for the Recovering People Pleaser. It is always a hell of a lot of fun. It's one of my favorite ones to facilitate. And I'm dropping the link in the comments so that if you would like to join us, you can. You can also snag a link to the on-demand recording and watch it whenever you want, maybe today. Let me see here. I think, in terms of respecting boundaries, I think I'm gonna head out. I have some breakfast to eat. I'm feeling hungry and I'm ready to rock and roll. But it was so fun chatting with you guys. Definitely be sure to hang out at the workshop. It's on March 23rd at 5 p.m. You can snag the on-demand recording at your leisure now. And this will be recorded and saved on my profile. So if you miss some of it and you want to rewind and watch, you can. Have a beautiful day, and thanks everybody for hanging out.